Yeah.
Back at it like a good habit, man. Y'all already know. Y'all already know. We got another Thomas Sowell.
Okay.
Facts about slavery never mentioned in school.
Oops, my Mac been down here. Okay.
Your Mac. My Mac has been down now.
But those might pick up pretty good.
My Mac been down now. My Mac. Apple computer.
Okay, let's do this. Oh, okay. Now I'm interested. I don't hear nothing. Do you?
Not yet. Black rednecks. Yeah.
I want to read this book of Peers. I have several books I'm reading now. That's the only reason why I haven't gotten it. But that's the one I want to read.
The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean.
See, that I was just on that alone, just so in that 45 seconds in, is my thinking. What I've learned is people are just thinking like just slave. You know how much money, what you had to be paid to be able to have that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, meaning to.
Remember we heard something that said you would have had to take it. One slave would have probably cost somebody a whole year's salary to have one slave.
Right.
People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. The peoples of the Balkans were enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere.
Wow.
Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans. Asians enslaved other Asians.
Right.
Africans enslaved other Africans.
Yeah.
And the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself. Wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. In East Africa, the Maasai were feared slave raiders, and other African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. As late as 1891, it was reported that Manyuema slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere. Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million.
Wow.
The form in which the story of slavery has reached most people today has been along the lines of the best-selling book and widely watched television miniseries Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by."
A myth?
This instrumental use of history, or purported history, is open to the same objections as other instrumental myth-making. Despite the impression created by Roots, during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself. The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year. By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible.
Wow. What you got to say?
It was my whole understanding of slave. I know we've seen certain things, but listen to this. This is even more detailed.
Mm-hmm.
My whole acknowledgement and understanding of slavery was a lie.
It was regular business throughout the world.
They had them sitting right there on the beach. They're right on the beach. And he said, white people They just want to pick it up and hurry and get out of there because they wouldn't live long because it was malaria. So they had to get the people and go. The tough part is, how do you know none of the slaves got malaria? I'm sure they did.
So the misconception and some of the things that we got from roots.
And then he said he wanted to give them a myth.
Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans, who established the conditions under which slave sales took place. The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples.
Wow.
The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and Polynesia.
Wow.
In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors. And the Nyoro and Hima of Anko enslaved Toro women and children. The Tutsi dominated the Hutu in Rwanda. The Maasai lorded it over the Kikuyu and Kamba. And the latter, in turn, held the Indorobo in a kind of serfdom.
Wow.
It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was, with some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children.
Wow.
Historian David Brion Davis pointed out that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, and that as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before. The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners. Although most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families, there were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts. An estimated 1/3 of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War.
In Louisiana?
He said 1/3
in Louisiana.
owned their own slaves.
Wow. Where is all this in the history books?
Why would you give people history that will make them move on in a direction of accountability?
Wow. This is completely new.
Amazing.
Total new perspective.
Amazing.
Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean. In short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West, even in the 19th century. And outside the West, slavery was too widely accepted to require defense. No other nation ended slavery in the same way as the United States did, and few ended it after so short a struggle, as history is measured. How and why did slavery end in most of the world? There were two major processes. Over the centuries, as more and more territories around the world consolidated into nation-states with their own armies and navies, raiding those territories to capture and enslave the people who lived within them became more hazardous in itself, and also risked military retaliation against the countries from which the raiders came. Thus, more and more peoples became off-limits to slave raiders over time. Put differently, the areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies. Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons, to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans, the backwaters of Asia, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. By the early modern era, sub-Saharan Africa, with its numerous and severe geographic handicaps, was one of the last remaining areas from which vast numbers of people could be enslaved.
So if you didn't have that money, first of all,
then you can help no way.
And then they said the people that were mostly getting enslaved were the weaker communities, the ones that weren't weak, but the strong ones, they weren't enslaving them like that. The ones that had a strong economic setup, tribes, but the ones that had the weaker tribes, them the ones that got
pounded
by other slaves.
Yep.
By other tribes.
Right.
And were set up. Go down there so you can be bought out. So going on the beach because the such gonna come and pick you up.
1/3 of the people in
the
free in Louisiana
had their own slaves.
Wow.
See, they make it seem like you down, the people in the bayou running.
Or
we gotta get out of here,
hurting.
baby.
Yeah. Or please.
No, man, it's just so messed up, man. It's so messed up that the thought of how you taught all up to this point that this was done to you, and then you come to find out that, again, I know we did a video similar to this that Thomas Sowell did, but or did we do this one? Or was it did we do this, or was it the Joe Rogan one the guy was talking about? No. The Joe Rogan was separate. That was about Black culture and what we got. So anyway, this was again such a lesson. This was even more detailed.
I knew I opened. I got to read this book. This is one of the books. When I went on his site and was trying to look at some articles, I saw all the books that he wrote, and I said, okay, this one seems like this is going to be one that I'm going to want to read. So I definitely am going to add this to my list.
Yeah,
this would be the first book that I would have read by him. But I got an article that I wanted to talk about, but I got to really focus and zoom in, because he using some big words. Plus,
but
but some of the jargon is like, okay, focus, and get into the empirical mindset of reading an empirically reviewed article, because they read different than your regular article in one of just a regular health, or education magazine. It ain't the same.
True.
But anyway, I'm looking forward to it.
All right, man. Like, comment, subscribe. Don't take a nosedive. Comment in the section below if you want to support, man. We appreciate y'all.
See you guys in the next video, and go check out some of the new we haven't put it up there yet, but we're going to have some new content on Buy Me a Coffee, where we're diving into some subjects a little deeper. All right, guys.
All right.